Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present Trying Times, a Miamian's experience as a people's lawyer. Joining us for today's conversation are alumnus Terry Gilbert and Miami faculty member Mark Curnutte. Terry Gilbert is a 1970 graduate of Miami University and has been in private law practice since 1973, focusing on criminal defense and civil rights litigation. At the start of his legal career, Terry represented American Indians in the aftermath of the Wounded Knee confrontation in South Dakota and numerous anti-war and civil rights activists. Throughout his career, he has handled a variety of cases involving police abuse, wrongful conviction, violations of free speech, prisoners' rights, and victims of all forms of discrimination. Terry now resides with his wife, Robin, in a Cleveland suburb and has two adult children, Benjamin, a molecular biologist, and Julian, a law student. Mark Curnutte is a 1984 Miami University graduate with undergraduate degrees in geography and English. He is a career newspaper journalist who reported extensively on social issues of race, class, poverty, homelessness, and immigration, and was 3 times selected top reporter in Ohio for work produced in 2012, 2013, and 2018. Mark joined Miami's Department of Sociology and Gerontology as a visiting instructor in August of 2019, after working 3 semesters as an adjunct teaching social justice studies and journalism courses. Welcome to you both, Terry and Mark. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Just a reminder for our viewers, questions were collected during registration, and both Mark and Terry will attempt to address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button on the bottom. Please note that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for questions and answers. And with that, I will turn it over to Terry and Mark to get this very timely conversation started. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Thank you, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, Terry, I haven't picked up your book yet, but it's on my list, and I'm going to pick it up. And but just talking with you previously and reading about you, you have had a remarkable career. And like so many of us, we're heavily shaped by our experience at Miami. And your timing, I would suspect had the time you were on campus and coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s had a lot to do with who you are and who you became. Can you reflect on what it was like to be on a college campus, specifically Miami, in the late 60s and early 70s during the height of the anti-war movement?
Well, my experience at Miami was profound in terms of leading me to the pathway that I took as a civil rights lawyer and activist. We hear a lot about the 60s, and it's, a very complex political and cultural period in our history. I started in Miami as a freshman in 1966, where when you went to football games, you had to wear a blazer and a tie. And by the time I left in 1970, I was somewhat of a hippie, activist, anti-war protester, and thinking about what I was going to do in the future to make social change a reality. So it was a perfect storm of transitioning from an era of conformity and post-war non-conformity type of living. I was raised in a working class Jewish family in Cleveland. I didn't have parents that, instilled in me political activism. So it all came together in the late 60s. And interestingly, at Miami, which was pretty much of a conservative school, but by the time of my senior year, during the Vietnam War, the conscience of the students became more sharpened in terms of questioning that war and questioning many other things. So in the spring of 1970, I was confronted with those situations, and Miami had, interestingly enough, a very robust political struggle against the war. And then on May 4th, all hell broke loose with the Kent State shootings. And within 7 days, or within a week after the shooting of 4 students and the wounding of 9, Miami University shut down, closed, and I graduated that spring, having taken no classes during that period. And so Miami actually was some years earlier was at Western College, the focal point of freedom riders going down to Mississippi to deal with voting registration down there. And 3 of those people who were here in Oxford wound up being murdered by the Klan, Cheney, and 2 others. So a lot of things were going on at the time, and immediately I went into law school because I was a political science major, and I wanted to be able to use the legal skills to advance social justice. So Miami was very critical. Kent State was very critical because it deeply affected me emotionally. And also, I wound up being a lawyer for the May 4th Coalition later on, when the students at Kent were attempting to stop the building of a gymnasium on the site where the National Guard fired volleys of bullets into innocent people who were just out there expressing their First Amendment rights.
You showed we showed a photo here that you provided from the Rowan Hall sit-in. And for those of us that are a tiny bit younger, I remember on campus when it was still Rowan Hall, which I believe was one of the ROTC buildings at the time. And current students, sort of recent alumni, may know it better as the Armstrong Student Center. It was obviously remodeled and reopened. But what was that? You participated in the protest at Rowan Hall, Terry. What was that, again, knowing the type of school that you entered in 1966, then to participate and see, as you said, there was a robust student activism against the war, which was somewhat kind of, again, atypical for what Miami's reputation had been.
Right. So actually, the takeover of Rowan Hall was 2 weeks or so before Kent State. That spring, there was a national student mobilization group, national efforts to stop the war in Vietnam. And this takeover, so to speak, at Rowan Hall was part of that. It was interesting because President Shriver at the time was a very respected member of the faculty and administrator, was well liked, and he actually was brave enough to come into Rowan Hall during the takeover and address the students, recognizing their concerns, recognizing their free speech. He was not confrontational. On the other hand, he eventually capitulated to Governor Rhodes, who cracked down on the protests of that spring, unfortunately. The same kind of cracking down that led to Kent State. So Miami University in 1970 could have been another Kent State. But it wasn't necessarily because of President Shriver, but because of the governor of the state of Ohio, Rhodes, who I believe had blood on his hands for whipping up the antagonism at the campus of Kent State. So my formative years at Miami leading to the work at Kent State kind of left a lasting mark about the importance of activism and protest, which we are seeing now in a new wave of interest of people, mainly younger generation from the 1960s, and now we have in 2020, 2021, similar movements emerging. Not that there wasn't activism all those 40, 50 years, but it seems to me that the George Floyd protests about police and racism in police and criminal justice reform is very similar to the kind of things that we were dealing with back then. And an important thing is to remember is that these both situations involve crackdowns by law enforcement. In the 60s and 70s, we had efforts by police, FBI to infiltrate activist groups and suppress protests, arrest people, charge people, put them in jail. And now we've been seeing that in the last year or so. Under the George Floyd protests, there were over millions of people around the country who protests and tens of thousands who were arrested, many brutally. Most of the charges and the arrests were thrown out. So we have a parallel here between two distinct generations, but very similar in the terms of trying to deal with the intensity of the problems that exist in America in terms of equality, in terms of race, in terms of criminal justice. And so I have to say that I was guided by those experiences early on and continue to be, as I still practice law and still take on these cases. And then, of course, the experience with Native Americans was a real eye-opener for me because through a progressive legal organization called the National Lawyers Guild, during the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1972, where there were shootouts between a ragtag group of American Indians at Wounded Knee in South Dakota and the full power of United States law enforcement, including the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, and other military units. Unfortunately, two Native Americans were killed, and a marshal also lost his life. But there was a call for lawyers to come out to South Dakota to represent over 300 people who were charged with all kinds of offenses relating to the situation at Wounded Knee, which was a 73-day occupation before there was a negotiated end to that. Point is, I was out in South Dakota off and on for 3 years, working on the reservations, working with other lawyers around the country, standing up to efforts to infiltrate our law office. And that was a real eye-opener for me because I was really in a war zone out there in South Dakota. People can't realize it, that the reservations out there are very poor, very oppressed, yet this was land that was rich with resources, rich with history and spirituality, the Black Hills. And here they were fighting for recognition of their sovereignty and their right to self-determination over their own lands and their culture, which had been suppressed for hundreds of years. So it was a thrilling experience for me to be part of that, but it also allowed me to understand the history of this country, that it wasn't always so rosy. We all know about slavery, of course, and we're still dealing with that. But you got to remember, these were original people. These were people who lived here for thousands of years and were being treated as foreigners when they were here first. And their land was stolen, their resources were stolen. They were sent to Christian schools. And so in the 60s, there was a resurgence of consciousness around many young American Indians through the American Indian movement. And it was great to be part of that. And that set me on a pathway to never forget who these people are and what they went through, and that they needed the protections of the Constitution as much as anybody else. So that process led to my work in my own hometown of Cleveland to challenge the mascot of the Cleveland Indians baseball team, which for many, many years was almost impossible because the fans were so devoted, but don't think they really understood the implications of that mascot and how it demeaned a very proud people in a cartoonish kind of way. And that I started working on that in even before I became a lawyer, and all the way through 1983 through a lawsuit. And then over the years, representing protesters who would gather at the Progressive Field and protest the Wahoo and the name. And now, based on some of the debates going on after George Floyd, the team not only is getting rid of the mascot, but is getting rid of the name itself. And so being older like me and living through all these periods allows me to see, how social change develops over time. That the victories are few and far between, but you still make your point and you still educate people and turn the attitudes around. And not that you can change everybody's beliefs, but we are at a point now where we changed a major institution which made millions and millions of dollars off of that logo, and still do, on the backs of American Indians. And yet they have now, through that long struggle of activism, have backed down and have agreed to join the 21st century in terms of respecting our Native American brothers and sisters. So
you brought up a really interesting point, Terry, that also connects the era you came of age in the late 60s, early 70s to what we've seen in the United States. Almost, if you start with what COVID revealed, the inequality and inequity in our society because of Native American communities, Black communities, and Latinx communities being harmed more by the pandemic because of pre-existing health conditions and other disparities, economically, access to healthcare. But it's interesting, as you point out, in the same way, the heightened awareness that came with the civil rights movement, it accelerated the American Indian movement, it accelerated the women's rights movement, it accelerated the environmental movement. And it was really fascinating, as you just said, that sadly it took the murder, now legally the murder of George Floyd, to spur other intersectional change, not just the Cleveland baseball team. You have the Washington football team abandoning really the horrific nickname that used to be our alma mater, unfortunately, and people that still stubbornly hold on to that. But you bring up, again, so much of this is connected. Human rights, civil rights. And I think the other thing that is really remarkable about your career, and I'm sure is detailed in depth in your book, is it wasn't just one group of rights that are important. It's the rights for all people who are oppressed, who are fighting. And that led you, I think, a large amount of your career was spent criminal justice, law enforcement abuses, innocence projects, the drug war. Could you talk about that major component of your career as you really focused on issues of deep concern to African Americans in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected. I mean, the denial of rights to one group affects everybody, because under the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the benchmark was all men, all humans are created equally. And that has not been the case. And we have not realized that ideal, and we have not realized that dream. And it works its way into divisions in culture, in race, in economics, in terms of privilege, in terms of who gets to decide what kind of government we have, as we're dealing with right now with the voting issues. I mean, so I don't want to sound too like spiritual that everything is connected, but it really in politics it always is. And there are many groups that still are dealing with it. And the civil rights movement in the 60s created some incredible results in terms of the Civil Rights Act. It's which somehow, Lyndon Johnson was able to get Congress to pass, and it's done a lot of great things, but it hasn't yet fulfilled its promise, because we're still dealing with things like qualified immunity in terms of, police accountability. We're still dealing with LGBT and gender issues, where people who identify that way are not able to exercise the same rights and get the same benefits as others. So, and for me, my main focus in the recent decades has been the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, because in the 80s, during the crack epidemic, it fell largely on the African American and Latino community. And both the Democrats and the Republicans all came together and took this law and order approach, which created a penal system that is in terms of its population in America is probably the largest in the world, particularly the Western world. And that could be traced to this idea of the badges and incidents of slavery, because the drug war gave the police so much power to come into the communities and target those who are at the end of the supply chain. Rarely did it go to the top levels, the money launderers, the importers, and also the interactions of government organizations and the corruption that existed. So we now have this. We still have this criminal justice system that's heavy on police aggressiveness, which is not an answer to solving crime. It just creates more people going to prison and ruining their lives and ruining their families' lives without many opportunities. We also see that there's a lot of people in prison who are mentally ill, who are not getting the help that they need and commit crimes because of their mental illness. And there's a way of keeping America safe without having mass incarceration and without having military-style policing. And we could talk about that endlessly, but this has been a focus of mine. Also, the idea that those who are charged with crimes, depending on their economic abilities, those who have money, who can hire, good lawyers, usually get a better outcome, and then people who are indigent get the short end. And the statistics show that it once again falls upon minorities and people of color. And I started to get involved in the Innocence Project because I was seeing the value of showing some of the flaws in the criminal justice system, because we were able to actually get people out because of DNA exclusions, and which could not be questioned. And then we look back and see, well, why were these people convicted by a jury if now we know 20, 30 years later that DNA exonerates them? And it's because some of the assumptions of how trials work had to be reevaluated. Eyewitness identification, misconduct by police in concealing evidence, poor forensics, and things like that. So to me, that's a major calling in my career, because there's nothing worse than anybody going to prison for who is innocent. And I've been fortunate to be able, and I talk about it in the book, to be on the cutting edge of that innocence movement, where we have been able to achieve release of many people who were even some on death row would have been executed when they were victims of various forms of misconduct and inequities in the criminal justice system. So that's one of my pet projects now, is to expand the idea of looking back at old cases.
The fascinating thing, Terry, that this all adds up to is that I obviously didn't know you when you were starting. We've only spoken a couple of times, but you retain a high energy level, a great, a very strong commitment to justice. We all can do the math. You were class of 70, so you've had a long career, you've done a lot, and you maintain an energy and a vigor and a commitment to human rights, to civil rights, to justice. How do you do that? How do you prevent, again, because like you said, there's this new generation, and I teach many of them at Miami in our social justice courses, who are extremely passionate, coming of age with kind of the revelation of, in their minds at least, George Floyd was a new thing. And then learning that this is not a new thing. And then seeing what happened because of COVID and seeing the economy crater.
All right.
How do you prevent, or what's your advice to people that are entering or are working in this field to prevent burnout and to stay active and involved? How have you managed to retain and maintain your energy level, focus, and your commitment all these years?
Well, it hasn't been all that easy. I mean, there were moments when I was burned out, I was disappointed, disgusted with the system. I was attacked. I was held in contempt. I was viewed as a outsider, but I kept plugging away. And there were other people around the country that supported that kind of approach. I mean, it's a personal decision that people have to make. If you believe that there are wrongs in the world, if you believe that the government is not doing enough to provide opportunities for people, if you're unhappy with any aspect of the society. I happen to dedicate my work to criminal justice reform, but there are other, there's poverty, there's housing issues, there's you know, job issues, all kinds of things where these core problems have existed for generations. And even if we're not there, it's possible to get to change. And people give lip service to all this, but they don't really find an avenue to express themselves and to make a difference. So it's a personal decision. I became a lawyer and thought, well, being, you know, fighting for justice is what lawyers should do. And that's what I've done. And I've been very happy about that. And I continue to work on these issues as long as I have my brain working. But, you know, you're a journalist. And I thought about being a journalist. And you do that in your own way by writing and teaching. It could be just that, you know, you bring up these issues in your workplace, in your neighborhood, and, you know, get involved in government, get involved in electoral politics, whatever it is that you feel can make a difference. And because that's how progress, to the extent that we've had progress, and we have in America, I'm not saying it's all been that bad. We've had high moments and low moments. But the change that we've had comes from the bottom up, okay? It comes from the people, not from the government telling us how we're going to work this out and how we're going to work that out and move forward. It comes from the people who demand their government to address grievances and problems that are affecting the masses. And we saw that. We saw that in the last year before our own eyes, how prosecutors around the country who had been, you know, covering up, you know, police shootings and things like that, you know, are now coming around and addressing that. Police are training better around the country. They're recognizing that they can do better. And we saw that, you know, Derek Chauvin was convicted by a jury, which is rare. We can't even, many of the cases that we have, we can't get the prosecutors to even look at filing charges against police who use excessive force. So actually, it's a positive notion. You know, how you make a living doesn't matter. You could be a scientist, you can be a person in a union, but you know, every citizen needs to be aware that social justice is key to the advancement of America, and it's key to a democratic society. And I think I hope that my book can outline a little bit of a roadmap for each of you individually who read it and find your own way into participating in changing the world.
That's a nice wrap up. And the great thing, Terry, is we got some questions in advance, and I'm gonna kick it back to Molly for a minute and see if she wants to, you know, chime in or add anything at this point. And then we do have some submitted questions from people who probably are on today, and I can get to those. But Molly, I wanted to go back to you and see if you had anything to interject at this point.
You're muted.
Story of my life. I'm always muted.
All of our lives.
I have nothing to add right at this very moment. If you want to go ahead and proceed with the questions that came in during registration, that will give me time to go through these questions that are coming in now.
Great. I will do that. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
And so really what was fascinating, and bring this into current events, our first question, Terry, Monday morning, a representative of Equal Justice Initiative was in Oxford, and Miami, two African-American scholars had led a Truth and Reconciliation movement since 2018, and it culminated, well, not culminated, but a major stepping stone was the placing of a historical narrative marker commemorating 2 lynchings of African-American men by extrajudicial white mobs in the late 19th century. It's there on High Street, uptown, in the park. And so one of the first questions that came in during registration, speaking of Equal Justice Initiative, was, are you familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama? And how would you say your work has been different or similar to what EJI has done? And
yeah, I'm very familiar with Equal Justice Initiative in the South. Brian Stevenson is one of my heroes. And I'm sure most of you know about him and the work that he's done. That group specifically deals with, a lot of death penalty cases, because that is an issue that really needs to be resolved, because not only because of the moral question or whether it's a deterrent, but because it hits hard on minorities like everything else. But they're targeting mainly post-conviction, meaning in cases that have already been tried, where people are in death row, and try to get them out, try to get their cases overturned, and some trial work relating to death penalty cases. I do not do death penalty cases. I've done maybe 1 or 2. It takes a real unique individual to be able to handle death penalty cases, and they do it well. But it's all woven together. It's the various aspects of the criminal justice system that require specific responses, and that group has been around, and it's doing great things. So we work with them, and we're all part of the same kind of struggle to find equity and justice.
You just said that it takes a special kind of person to do death penalty cases, and that work that is remarkable, having covered two executions, sadly, in my career. Mm-hmm. Any advice, not so much the death penalty specifically, but more civil rights work that you've done, human rights work that you've done? What would your advice be for attorneys who are entering this specialized field that you've worked in for 50 years?
Yeah, I think actually more and more lawyers are beginning to gravitate towards civil rights, partly because my generation of civil rights lawyers have enhanced the ability to get remedies in court, even though there have been obstacles. So we kind of laid the groundwork for that practice to work. And so I highly recommend civil rights work. And actually, you can make a living doing it, because if you prevail in a civil rights case, the party that you're suing has to pay your legal fees. And so while it's difficult work, and it's erratic and not always productive in terms of financial rewards, more and more people are able to find a way to do that work and support their practice. Criminal defense is another area. It's an exciting field to be in the courtroom. It's to be in front of a jury if you have that talent, and it's also a way you can make a living. It's not going to make you rich, but it's very gratifying, because the criminal defense lawyers are the first line defense of the Constitution. everybody says, well, why are they representing criminals? How could they do that? But the important thing is that when a criminal defense lawyer goes into court, he or she is making sure that the system works and that people are not convicted wrongfully. And everybody has a right to an aggressive and zealous defense. So those two areas, maybe they're not so popular in terms of being a lucrative field, but I always thought that if you're going to be a lawyer, you might as well be in the action. I'm not saying that you should be that other areas of law are not rewarding, like corporate law or contract law, property, and those things. But even in those fields, there are equitable issues that regardless of what side of the case you're on, you could bring a more sensitive touch to the case and be empathetic to the humans that are involved in it and come up with resolutions that work for everybody. We're now beginning to see corporate recognition of political issues that have been on the backboard for many years. They, like in North Carolina, when there was, the idea of not allowing certain genders to go into certain bathrooms and that kind. Well, there was a boycott, and many of the corporations, big corporations, even like Coca-Cola in Georgia, have weighed in on these things. So it's just a matter of finding a way in your own particular world that you're in to make a difference. Law, to me, gets a bad rap. Lawyers get a bad rap, but one of the reasons I wrote this book, because you can see the side of lawyers that put their own personal interests to the side, make some sacrifices for the betterment of mankind. So that's something that I hope is left with the reader after reading the book.
That's nice. We did have a question, and you already answered it. It came from a fellow member of the class of 70 who was interested in hearing what effects the protests like Kent State and the campus shutdown had on your choice of profession. You explained that. We actually have a new question that just came in from a participant, a viewer today, and it kind of builds on what you were just talking about. And I'm gonna pull up the final question, advanced question that we had, and tie it, Terry, with a new question that just came in. But you talked about being raised Jewish. And the question from at registration was, how did the concept of, and I hope I don't mispronounce this, tikkun olam, repair the world, influence your work in social justice? And we had a new question just come in, and you may have answered it a little bit, but how can regular people who aren't in the legal field make meaningful contribution to social justice efforts? So really kind of the origins of, as you talked about, growing up Jewish and again, growing up Catholic, and the social justice teaching for me in the Catholic Church was pivotal. But you as a young Jewish man coming up, and then how can any of us, again, you talk about the place that we're in, and how can whoever we are with what gifts and talents we have make this contribution?
Yeah, well, I am obviously very familiar with the term tikkun olam, to repair the world. If you understand Jewish history and Jewish culture, we are people that experience a tremendous amount of oppression and persecution. The most recent was the Holocaust, but in that tradition is an idea that justice is critical. I mean, it just runs through the whole religion. I was seeing in the civil rights movement that many Jewish lawyers, including the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, were Jewish. my mentor, Eugene Bayer in Cleveland, and William Kunstler, the famous radical lawyer, both were Jewish. They were probably secular Jews. But, the movements for social change in this country, were Jewish figures were very, very much involved. I was in South Africa right before the pandemic, and went to the museum that commemorated the struggle of Nelson Mandela and the ANC. And I was delighted to see that many of the lawyers who represented Nelson Mandela and others during the 50s were Jewish lawyers. And I'm thinking, man, that's what I do. I try to do. And I realize that there's a long history of that. So it's in my DNA and a lot of other Jewish people, but it's in every religion has the notion of helping others and promoting justice. So it's not exclusively to Jews, but that's my particular experience.
Another question came in. Thank you for that. That's fascinating. And this again is directed to you, Terry. But when you were coming up, and you and I talked when we first met about the connection between journalists and lawyers, that we do some similar type of work, just in a different area. But when you were coming up, whether part of your formal education or your out of classroom education, were there writers or journalists who inspired you to pursue a career in civil rights work?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, I was inspired by Martin Luther King, by James Baldwin, and Noam Chomsky. Going back to philosophers, I even took a few hints from Karl Marx, although I don't consider myself a Marxist at this point. But and that happened. A lot of that happened in Miami. I'll tell you, because I had a great professor, Christian Rio, professor of government, who made us read the New York Times every week, Sunday magazine. That was our homework assignment. And then Weigel, Professor Weigel, who hung out with the hipsters and the Grateful Dead during the 60s, was an inspiration as well. I mean, so in this sea of conservatism at Miami, we had some pretty interesting characters during the 60s who were professors, who probably had tenure, they couldn't get rid of them, who instilled in many of us some good ideals that I've carried forward the rest of my career.
As we did in the early 80s, I'm proud to say. So,
right.
It's amazing faculty, and we're very, very fortunate. We have a last question, Terry, before we wrap up. As we talk in my social justice classes, we don't need to invent the wheel. The wheel's been invented in terms of where we can get involved, organizations that we can support or get involved with to make a difference. And I'm curious, in your long career and your many contacts, both within law and outside of law, what organizations, if people are interested in getting involved or want to support, which would you recommend, or which would you say are pretty effective in furthering this work that you have dedicated your life to?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a few organizations in the book that are nationally known. Obviously, one is the ACLU. They've been that group. I was a member of the board in Cleveland early on. They have stood up for civil liberties for 100 years, and they oversee a litigation powerhouse that has shown its effectiveness just in the last 4 years during the Trump era. going after immigration problems and things like that. Also, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is keeps track of white supremacist activities and the Klan, and that group is important more than ever now because of what we've just seen in this country with the Capitol insurrection. That these people came out of the woodwork and are all over the place and are organizing on social media. So that group, Southern Poverty Law Center, is very important in that particular issue. And there are, a number of groups, Lawyers for Civil Rights. There are local and regional groups. I would help out organizations like the Witness for Innocence, which is a group that provides support and help for those who have been exonerated from death row. It's an interesting group because these are not just exonerees; they're exonerees who were sentenced to die, and they get out and they have problems finding housing, jobs, medical care, mental health care, and so that's an organization because one of my clients, Kwame Ajamu, who he and his brother and another guy spent over 100 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. We're on death row for a while. He's part of that organization, so I want to give that a shout out. But I can if people have more questions about different organizations, I'd be glad to address those ideas some other forum if they want to reach out to me.
Well, that I think that wraps up some really remarkable observations and some really well-focused, insightful questions. And so again, Terry, here's the slide about your book. I look forward to picking it up and adding it to my reading list. And I am reminded as I listen to you by something that I share with every single one of my social justice students at Miami. And that's an excerpt from Martin Luther King's final speech that he gave on the night before his death on April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, where it's known as the mountaintop speech. And
Right.
You are living this out, Terry, because of your dedication to the Constitution, of each person's constitutional right to a defense, for what is stated in our founding documents. And I have students who have made memes of me saying this because they hear me say this all the time, which Dr. King saying, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. And I think that is you, as I listen to you and have had the honor and pleasure of getting to know you, and I've looked very much forward to reading your book and exchanging ideas with you as we move forward, and letting our fellow alums know that Terry will, at least by digitally, be visiting some of my students this fall at Miami in our justice courses, because I think they will really benefit from hearing from him. I think you've really lived out Dr. King's words, Terry, that you have worked and spent your life holding America to be true to what it put on paper. And I, for one, as a fellow Ohioan now, and as a fellow Miamian, as a human being, am greatly appreciative of what you've done and inspired. And I know that you meeting my students and our future Miami alums will have a great effect. So I'm grateful to Molly and JJ and the Alumni Association for introducing me to you, to asking me to be here today. And I just want to thank you on behalf of Ohioans and human beings who care about social justice, civil rights, human rights, for what you've done. And again, I look forward to furthering our relationship and introducing you to some more young people here at Miami. But thank you. And with that, I will toss it right back to Molly, and we'll come in under time. But Molly, thank you. And Terry, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Your day.
Oh, Thank you to you both for the work that you have both done. Terry, you particularly have done some really remarkable things, and thank you for sharing your story. I am most excited to have connected the two of you so that this is quite the brain trust between the two of you. So your students are very, very, very lucky.
Well, I look forward to coming down to Oxford in the near future.
Well,
Yes.
we'll stay in touch, and I'll take you up to Mac and Joe's for a coffee, right?
Right.
Now that you can. Well, thank you so much to you both for reminding us about the important work that has been done, and clearly the important work that remains to be done. Lots of hard work, I think, is still needed. So we really, really do appreciate you both participating in a very important conversation. That is all the time we have for today. Just as a reminder, a recording of this presentation will be available later on our website today. Just for sure, thank you again and again to Terry Gilbert and Mark Curnutte for your rich conversation today. We really appreciate you being here. And just to note, Trying Times is available at local Cleveland independent bookstores, and of course on Amazon and through PayPal by going to tryingtimes.act3, that's the number 3, creative.com. And please also check out our other new and archived webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. As always, thank you for joining us. Love and honor to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.